Mystery of Cabin Island, Chapter 11, which is called A Cryptic Notation. When we left off, the boys had spied a figure off in the dark, a second figure other than Hanley, that was wearing a long flowing white robe and a turban on his head out there in the dark. The ghost that Chet saw, Frank exclaimed as he stared at the snapshot of the white-robed man. You think so? Chet asked incredulously. It could be, Joe declared. I wonder who this person is. Remember, it's in the photograph. He took the photograph. Um, how he got here and where he is now. Perhaps he came with Hanley, Biff suggested. I doubt it, Frank replied. Look at the way the fellow's standing back in the shadow of the trees, almost as if he was spying on Hanley. Frank paused, then added, the first thing tomorrow, Joe and I will go to the mainland and phone Ike and Tad. If they're sore at Hanley, maybe they'll give us a lead on what his game is. You have to remember this story is a little bit old-fashioned, and they didn't have cell phones, so they couldn't just call. The cabin doesn't have a phone. Yes, and we'll ask if they're running a taxi service for a ghost, Joe grinned. Maybe this turban fellow stole our food, Chet remarked. Say, what are we going to do about that? Frank laughed. Tomorrow Joe and I will buy supplies, but you and Biff will have to stay and guard the island. I'll admit I'm hungry as a bear, too, Joe said. Likewise, Biff put in. Well, fellows, Chet began sheepishly, I forgot about this until now, but we can have a snack. The others stared at the rotund youth, who reddened as he explained. When I made sandwiches for lunch, I put some away in case of an emergency. Where are they? Asked Joe. We searched all over this place. Chet went into the bedroom he and Biff shared and returned with 5 thick sandwiches in a large plastic bag. Come on, where'd you hide 'em? Biff asked. In the bottom of my sleeping bag. You weren't thinking of an emergency, Joe scoffed. This was to be your midnight snack. Well, aren't you glad? Chet countered. You win, Frank said, and they devoured the sandwiches. Early the next morning, Frank and Joe felt insistent fingers tapping them awake. Get up, Chet implored. You have to go after groceries. The Hardys dressed hurriedly. Frank told Biff and Chet, while we're away, you might search the island for our stolen grub. Chances are that Hanley hid it all in one place not far from the cabin. Frank and Joe glided off in the ice boat, steered out of the cove, and soon were tying up at a nearby coastal summer resort named Surfside. The boys walked to the deserted main street. Place is really hopping, isn't it? Frank chuckled, surveying the tiny, weather-worn houses, many of them boarded up. Anyway, here's a phone. Joe pointed to an outside booth. He stood by and listened while his brother dialed Ike Nash's number. No answer, Frank reported. I'll try Tad. The Carson boy was home, but his responses to Frank's queries were rude and uncooperative. I don't know anything, Tad insisted. Hanley told us to scram and not snoop around, so we left. How about a man wearing a white robe? Did you taxi him to Cabin Island too? White robe? You're nuts. Tad laughed and hung up abruptly. That didn't accomplish much, Frank said wryly as he and Joe walked away from the booth. Let's see if we can find a place to buy food. Presently the boys stopped at a small frame building. A sign above the door proclaimed General Store, Amos Grice, proprietor. As the boys entered, a short elderly man with a bald crown and skinny wattled neck eyed them intently from his chair beside a black potbelly stove. And what might you lads be after? He chirped. Hello, said Frank. We're here for some groceries. Are you Mr. Grice? Yep. Odd to see strange faces around these parts this time of year, the storekeeper remarked. We're roughing it near here, Joe told the man. Amos Grice clucked. Most folks prefer sitting by a fire when winter comes on. Well, you're out early this morning. Necessity, Joe replied. Somebody stole our supplies. I declare, the old man looked startled. Don't tell me there's more folks trekking about in all this cold and snow. Seems that way, Joe grinned as he and Frank began to pick out canned goods and other food items. Where'd you boys say you're staying? The storekeeper asked when the Hardys brought their purchases to the counter. On Cabin Island, Joe replied. Cabin Island? Mr. Gryce repeated in surprise. Has Elroy Jefferson sold the place? No, Frank told him. Mr. Jefferson is letting us use his cabin during our Christmas vacation. Frank paid the storekeeper, who then commented, Elroy Jefferson's a fine sort. Haven't seen him in a while. What's he doing? He seems to keep busy traveling and collecting antiques, Joe replied. Mr. Gryce propped his elbows on the counter and said thoughtfully, Elroy Jefferson used to come in here every Tuesday for supplies, and the little fellow with him. He loved Johnny like his own son. And where's the youngster nowadays? We don't know, Mr. Gryce, Frank answered, not wishing to reveal anything about their case to the friendly but gossipy proprietor. Mr. Jefferson always was crazy about antiques, the storekeeper went on. I recall how upset he was when his medal collection disappeared. Have you any idea what happened to it? Joe asked. Nope. All I know is the medals disappeared, and so did John Sparewell. Do people believe he stole the medals? Frank asked. Not that I've heard, but it was odd he vanished at the same time. The Hardys exchanged glances, but did not comment, and Gryce went on. You know, boys, just about a week ago, a fellow was in here asking about Jefferson's medals. I hadn't thought of 'em in years before this fellow came by. Somehow I didn't feel right to tell him a thing, so I didn't. Who was this man? Frank asked. Don't know, never seen him before. He was a scary sort, dressed up like Halloween. He had something wrapped around his head. The Hardys' thoughts flew to the ghost. Joe asked, Do you remember anything else about the person? Did he tell you why he was interested in the medals? Amos Gryce wrinkled his brow. I got rid of that spooky fellow soon's I could. After a few more minutes of conversation, the boys said goodbye and left. They walked quickly toward the Seagull. What do you think of Mr. Gryce's scary visitor? Joe asked his brother. Frank replied, I'm sure it was the man in the turban and the white robe, and he's apparently interested in the medals, too. Say, Joe exclaimed, maybe he is in league with Hanley. I'll bet they're both after the collection and think there's some clue to it on the island. The boys climbed into the Seagull with their bag of groceries. I'll concentrate on your lunch while you take a turn at the tiller, Frank told Joe. Swell with me, Joe grinned. Out on the bay, the Seagull swerved and dipped like a live thing. The wind's picked up, Joe called out. I'll say. Joe deftly guided the ice boat toward the narrow inlet, the wind pushing them faster every moment. But suddenly it changed directions sharply. A wild gust whacked the Seagull's sail. The craft hiked crazily and streaked straight for the rocky shore. Lean! Joe shouted. The boys shifted their weight, and Joe threw all his strength against the tiller, while Frank trimmed the sail. The boat began to turn, but the jagged rocks loomed close. We're going to hit, yelled Joe, bracing himself for the splintering crash. But the ice boat skimmed past, safe by no more than 2 inches. Whew, Frank said with a big sigh of relief. Joe looked grim. We're not out of trouble yet. This wind is tricky. Strong gusts continued to buffet the craft, but the boys were able to control it. At last the wind moderated, and Joe steered the ice boat through the narrow inlet to the island. When the Seagull was safe inside the boathouse, Chet and Biff came bounding through the snow to meet the Hardys. That was great sailing, Biff exclaimed. We were watching you. It was rough, Joe admitted, handing the groceries to Chet, who reached out eagerly for the bags. I'm afraid the eggs are scrambled. Well, if they aren't now, they will be, the cook replied, and headed straight for the kitchen. A short time later, the 4 sat down to a delicious breakfast. After the Hardys had reported on the trip to Surfside, Biff and Chet told of their failure to locate the stolen supplies. Let's look once more, Frank suggested, and explained that Tad and his pal knew nothing of Hanley's departure from the island. And he certainly didn't carry those heavy cartons across the ice, Joe stated. All footprints had been obliterated by the wind-drifted snow, so their task was more difficult. Chances are they're hidden nearby, Frank said. We'll go without snowshoes this time so we can kick up the drifts. As soon as breakfast was over, they set out. First they searched in the snow which had piled against the cabin, but found nothing. Hanley probably carried the boxes out back, said Frank, leading the way to the kitchen door. Where is the nearest big drift? The boys looked around. Joe pointed to a mound of snow banked high against a large spruce at the edge of the clearing. The four hurried over and began kicking into the drift. Suddenly Biff cried, "Ouch!" "What's wrong?" asked Joe. "Stubbed my toe on the tree," Biff answered. "Hey, no, it's a can of fruit." Chet dug eagerly into the snow and gave a whoop of joy. "Here's the chow." The boys carried the containers of food to the kitchen. "This time we unpack everything," Chet declared. "Then it won't be so easy for someone to cart off." As Frank helped to remove the contents, his hand came upon a small brown notebook lying askew between two cans of beans. He plucked it out. "Look at this." "Whose is it?" Frank thumbed through the damp pages, most of which were torn loose. "Could this be the notebook we saw Hanley using?" asked Joe. Frank examined a few more pages and gave a low whistle of surprise. "I doubt it. See here? The name on the inside cover is John Paul Sparewell. That's the man that disappeared with the medals." "Sparewell!" Joe exclaimed. Biff shook his head, bewildered. "What was Sparewell doing here? Did he take our stuff? How many people are wandering around this island anyway?" Frank placed the notebook on the table where they could all examine it and began turning more pages. "Wow, see this?" Biff exclaimed. One of the loose pages contained a crudely drawn map. "That's Cabin Island," the boys cried out in unison. Another entry concerned rental of a boat. "Well, whether or not Sparewell has been here recently, it looks as though he was coming to Cabin Island regularly at one time," Joe remarked, "just like Hanley is now." On a page near the back of the notebook, the boys found a list of receipts for small sums. "Sparewell evidently had very little money," Frank commented. "He had problems, though," Joe observed. "Read the next item." The scrawled script said, "Appointment with Dr. Borden on Saturday. My condition worse. Would appeal to Jay, but am afraid." "I wonder if J is for Jefferson," Frank mused. "It sounds as though Sparewell was very ill. Perhaps he didn't live long after making these notes." "I don't believe Sparewell was the one who dropped this notebook," Joe reasoned. "He'd have frozen to death over here." The boy frowned in perplexity as he turned to the last page. All four stared at it in astonishment. "What kind of lingo is that?" Biff gulped. The letters at the bottom of the page were HJOSWSHRJWN HLSEWPARPAOA EWO WSPAPPOLSUL. Now, there are some spaces between those letters, but I can't really read spaces. "Coded message," Frank exclaimed.